On December 16, 2025, a single social media post transformed the Caribbean into an American lake, turning Venezuela's sovereign reserves into a 20 trillion strategic prize for the hegemon. While many predict a catastrophic collapse under the weight of a $35 trillion deficit, there's a technical and geopolitical path forward that few are talking about. It involves a specific intersection of U.S. technology and South American resources that renders traditional diplomacy obsolete. The headlines scream of naval blockades and high seas piracy, but the reality is far more calculated. We are witnessing the cold, hard logic of the American hegemon securing its balance sheet. This is not a descent into World War III. It is the execution of a multi-generational exit strategy. By reclaiming $20 trillion in assets from the Orinoco Belt, the United States is not merely punishing a challenger, it is leveraging its unique refining hegemony to turn Venezuelan heavy crude into a domestic financial lifeboat. While the international community debates the morality of asset seizure, the physical reality remains that only American crackers can process this specific resource. We have moved beyond the era of soft power into a period of absolute energy dominance, a pragmatic solution to the global chaos. This transition was not announced through the archaic channels of ambassadors and parchment, nor was it debated in the halls of the United Nations. It manifested instantaneously, driven by the speed of modern digital infrastructure, when a single notification on a social media platform effectively erased a sovereign nation from the global ledger. This is the operational reality of the seamless integration of digital command and kinetic enforcement. The notification was merely the signal. The physical reality is currently displacing water in the Caribbean. A steel wall of Arleigh Burke-class destroyers has sealed the maritime corridors, enforcing a blockade that is absolute, impermeable, and terrifyingly precise. The directive is binary. Nothing enters, nothing leaves, and any vessel attempting to circumvent this embargo is instantly reclassified as American property. While the media focuses on the spectacle of naval power, they are missing the technical nuance that makes this strategy viable. The true chokehold is not the destroyer sitting off the coast. It is the specific chemistry of the Orinoco Belt's reserves and the unique industrial capacity of the United States Gulf Coast. This is the calm analysis that financial markets are quietly banking on. The crude oil sitting beneath Venezuelan soil is not the light, sweet variety that can be easily processed by standard refineries in Europe or Asia. It is extra-heavy, sulfur-rich sludge, possessing a viscosity that is nearly solid at room temperature. To turn this geological asset into a liquid financial instrument, it requires complex upgraders and deep conversion refineries, specifically the massive coking units that line the coasts of Texas and Louisiana. This is the leverage that traditional diplomacy failed to utilize. The United States is not merely blockading a coastline, it is asserting its monopoly on the only technology capable of monetizing the prize. Even if Venezuela were to smuggle this heavy crude past the naval cordon, there are few buyers in the East capable of refining it efficiently without destroying their own infrastructure. The narrative that this will spark World War III ignores the realities of supply chain physics. China, often cited as the counterweight, lacks the specific refining redundancy to absorb millions of barrels of this specific heavy grade without massive capital expenditure and time they do not have. The chokehold, therefore, is structural. The United States has effectively trapped the asset in a closed loop where the only exit leads directly into the American reserve. We are witnessing the cold mathematics of debt servicing disguised as geopolitical conflict. The seizure of tankers carrying 4 million barrels is not piracy in the eyes of the hegemon. It is the first installment of a $20 trillion foreclosure. By physically controlling the flow of this specific heavy crude, Washington is executing a liquidation event to shore up its own balance sheet. This is the technical path to a soft landing for the American economy, substituting fiat currency printing with hard asset acquisition. The screams of neo-colonialism from Caracas are irrelevant to the algorithm of debt reduction. The blockade ensures that the only path to solvency for the region is total capitulation to American energy infrastructure, turning a potential chaotic collapse into a controlled, profitable refining operation. This is not the chaos of war, it is the rigorous enforcement of a new resource-backed security architecture. This architecture is foundational, resting on the distinct chemical reality of the prize itself. To the uninitiated observer, oil is a monolithic commodity, a fungible liquid exchanged on a screen. To the petroleum engineer and the sovereign strategist, the distinction between the light, sweet crude of the Permian Basin and the heavy, sulfur-laden bitumen of the Orinoco Belt is the difference between a finished product and raw industrial sludge. The 4 million barrels currently sitting in the hulls of the seized tankers and the 300 billion barrels waiting beneath the Venezuelan soil are functionally worthless without specific, high-complexity processing. They require deep conversion capacity, delayed coking units, and hydrocrackers that can break down long-chain hydrocarbons into gasoline and diesel. This infrastructure does not exist in sufficient capacity in Shanghai or Mumbai. It exists, almost exclusively, along the American Gulf Coast. By enforcing this blockade, the United States is not merely engaging in a military maneuver, it is closing the circuit on a technological monopoly. The narrative that this intervention will spark a global conflict ignores the logistical incapacity of America's rivals to utilize the asset. China, often projected as the inevitable counterforce, lacks the refining redundancy to process this specific grade of heavy crude without a multi-year, capital-intensive overhaul of its own downstream sector, an overhaul that is impossible while the U.S. Navy controls the shipping lanes. There is no World War III on the horizon, because there is no viable economic incentive for a peer competitor to fight for a resource they cannot refine. The chaos feared by the public is, in reality, a high-stakes corporate acquisition backed by naval supremacy. We are witnessing a fundamental shift in how the hegemon manages its solvency. For decades, the United States relied on the diplomatic export of the dollar, backed by the full faith and credit of the government. Faced now with a national debt exceeding $35 trillion, faith is no longer sufficient collateral. The pivot is toward hard asset acquisition. The seizure of Venezuela's energy infrastructure represents a $20 trillion injection of tangible equity into the American balance sheet. This is the calculated trade-off. Washington is willingly sacrificing its diplomatic reputation and the soft power of the late 20th century to secure the hard energy dominance required for the 21st. The screams from the United Nations regarding the violation of sovereignty are noise. The stabilization of the bond market is the signal. This is the mechanism of a soft landing. By physically securing the collateral, land, oil, and mineral wealth, the United States transforms its debt from a theoretical burden into a resource-backed obligation. The algorithm of debt reduction requires revenue, and the most efficient path to revenue is the seizure of underutilized assets that can be optimized by American technology. This is not the erratic behavior of a declining empire flailing in the dark. It is the cold, deliberate action of a hegemon liquidating a delinquent borrower to ensure its own survival. The blockade is simply the foreclosure notice posted on the door of the Caribbean. To understand why this foreclosure is proceeding with such clinical precision and why the specter of a kinetic World War III is a hallucination born of anxiety rather than analysis, one must look past the destroyers patrolling the coastline and focus on the molecular reality of the asset itself. The media consumes the imagery of naval blockades because it is cinematic. It speaks to the primal fear of conflict. However, the true mechanism of this acquisition is not military, but chemical. The prize sitting beneath the Venezuelan soil, the Orinoco Belt, is not the light, sweet crude that bubbles easily from the sands of the Middle East. It is extra heavy, sour crude, a viscous tar-like sludge with high sulfur content and a density that barely allows it to flow at room temperature. This geological distinction is the single most critical variable in the geopolitical calculus, yet it is almost entirely absent from public discourse. This oil is chemically useless to a nation that lacks the specific, capital-intensive infrastructure required to refine it. You cannot simply put Orinoco sludge into a standard refinery designed for Brent crude. The sulfur would corrode the metallurgy, and the heavy carbon chains would clog the distillation towers. To monetize this $20 trillion asset, one requires complex crackers, delayed coking units, and hydro-treating facilities capable of breaking down these heavy molecules into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. Here lies the unspoken checkmate. The United States Gulf Coast is the only industrial complex on Earth with the installed capacity to process this specific grade of crude at the necessary scale. For decades, while the American public debated the morality of fossil fuels, the American energy sector was quietly building the most sophisticated refining engine in history, specifically calibrated for heavy sour inputs. This is the PAD-3 district, an interlocking network of steel, steam, and catalysts that represents hundreds of billions of dollars in sunk costs. To replicate this infrastructure elsewhere, say in China or India, would require not only a decade of construction, but hundreds of billions in capital expenditure at a time when global interest rates make such mega projects financially prohibitive. Furthermore, the specialized technology and proprietary catalysts required to optimize these yields are guarded by American intellectual property laws and export controls. Therefore, the fear of a peer competitor like China intervening militarily to save Venezuela is structurally unfounded. What would Beijing fight for? A resource they cannot process efficiently. A supply chain that would require shipping heavy heated sludge halfway across the world, past American carrier groups, only to arrive at refineries ill-equipped to handle it. There is no return on investment for such a conflict. The hegemon understands that in the 21st century, warfare is a balance sheet exercise. By controlling the only viable downstream destination for the resource, the United States has rendered the resource valueless to anyone else. The blockade is merely the physical enforcement of a technological reality. Venezuelan oil is American oil because only America can turn it into money. This technological monopoly allows the United States to pivot its strategy for national solvency. The public panic regarding the $35 trillion debt is rooted in a misunderstanding of how sovereign obligations are settled at the imperial level. Debt is only a crisis when the borrower lacks the assets to cover the liability. By physically integrating the Venezuelan reserves into the American energy portfolio, Washington is effectively performing a debt-for-equity swap on a continental scale. The bond market, which values stability and collateral above all else, recognizes this immediately. When the United States signals that it is securing $20 trillion in hard assets, the risk premium on treasuries stabilizes. The soft landing is not achieved by spending less. It is achieved by acquiring more. This is the cold arithmetic of the new era. The diplomatic standing that pundits claim is being lost was a fiat currency of the previous century, a soft power construct that holds no value in a world of resource scarcity and hard asset competition. The United States is trading the intangible approval of the UN General Assembly for the tangible security of total energy dominance. It is a rational exchange. In the ledger of history, solvency outweighs popularity. The screams of imperialism are irrelevant noise against the signal of renewed economic foundations. The operation also serves a critical function in domestic stabilization, directly addressing the anxieties of the populace who fear economic destitution. The integration of these assets provides a deflationary pressure on energy costs within the dollar zone, a benefit that will ripple through every sector of the American economy, from logistics and manufacturing to agriculture. By securing the feedstock for the Gulf Coast refineries, the hegemon ensures that the internal cost of production for American industry remains lower than that of its competitors in Europe and Asia. This is the onshoring of economic security. It is a pragmatic firewall against global volatility. While the rest of the world navigates a chaotic transition to green energy with insufficient baseload power, the United States secures a century of hydrocarbon density to bridge the gap, ensuring that its lights stay on and its factories keep running while its rivals face deindustrialization due to energy poverty. We must also scrutinize the timing of this seizure. It is not accidental. It occurs precisely when the global financial system is straining under the weight of fiat expansion. The seizure acts as a psychological anchor. It tells the world that the dollar is no longer just backed by the full faith and credit of the government, a phrase that has lost its potency, but is now backed by the physical control of the Western Hemisphere's energy output. This moves the dollar closer to a resource-backed currency without the constraints of a gold standard. It is a petrodollar 2.0, where the backing is not an agreement with the Saudi kingdom, but direct ownership of the reserves themselves. This shift demystifies the fear of World War III because it clarifies the incentives. A global war requires a challenger who believes they can win a decisive economic advantage through combat. But the United States has structured the playing field so that combat yields no economic advantage to the aggressor. The chaos that the public perceives, the naval maneuvers, the harsh rhetoric, the suspension of diplomatic norms, is actually the orchestrated friction of a hostile takeover. It is corporate rating applied to geopolitics. The volatility is localized, controlled, and purposeful. It is not the unraveling of order. It is the imposition of a new, harder order. The algorithm of the hegemon acts to eliminate variables. Venezuela was a variable, an unstable regime aligned with foreign adversaries, sitting on critical collateral. The operation converts this variable into a constant. By seizing the assets, the United States removes the uncertainty of supply shocks and eliminates the potential for a foreign foothold in the Caribbean. It closes the back door. This is why the response from the rest of the world has been performative rather than kinetic. The European Union issues statements of concern, but quietly anticipates the stability of global oil prices that American control will ensure. China issues warnings, but calculates that it can buy oil from the Americans easier than it can fight for it. Russia is preoccupied with its own attrition. The board has been cleared for this move. Ultimately, the reveals that this is a story of infrastructure, not ideology. It is about the specific gravity of crude oil, the complexity of hydrocracking, and the yield per barrel. It is about the physics of the bond market, where 20 trillion in assets creates a gravitational well that keeps the dollar from spinning into the void. The deep state, or rather the permanent administrative apparatus of the hegemon, has run the simulations. They know that the only way to service the debt of the past is to seize the resources of the future. The morality of the action is irrelevant to the physics of its execution. The United States is not flailing, it is consolidating. It is stripping the copper wire from the walls of a delinquent tenant to pay the mortgage on the mansion. And because it owns the police force, the bank, and the court, the foreclosure will proceed without interruption. To understand the mechanics of this foreclosure, one must look past the political theater and stare directly into the molecular structure of the asset itself. The media consumes the narrative of ideology, debating socialism versus capitalism, but the hegemon operates on the narrative of geology and chemistry. The reality, the data point that quiets the chaos, is that not all oil is created equal. The shale revolution in the Permian Basin gave the United States energy independence, but it produced a specific type of resource, light, sweet crude. It is high quality, but it is chemically distinct from the diet required by the industrial metabolism of the American Gulf Coast. The massive trillion-dollar refinery complexes in Texas and Louisiana were not engineered for the light oil the United States now produces in abundance. They were built decades ago with billions in capital investment to digest the heaviest, most sulfurous sludge on the planet. They are designed for heavy, sour crude. This is the specific gravity of the Venezuelan reserves. This creates a structural mismatch that the market has been desperate to correct. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, yet the crude is effectively useless while it sits in the ground. It is tar. It is viscous, heavy, and filled with impurities that require the most advanced chemical engineering on Earth to process. Without the complex catalytic crackers and delayed coking units found almost exclusively on the U.S. Gulf Coast, Venezuelan oil is merely distinct dirt. It has no kinetic value until it passes through American infrastructure. This is where the war narrative collapses into a simple acquisition strategy. The audience fears World War III because they imagine a clash of armies, but the hegemon is executing a merger of supply chains. By seizing control of the Venezuelan output, the United States is not engaging in conquest for the sake of territory. It is engaging in a vertical integration strategy. We possess the hardware, the technological capacity to refine the resource. They possess the raw material. The operation currently underway is simply the forced removal of the inefficient middleman, the Maduro regime, to allow the physics of the market to function efficiently. This is the calm in the chaos that the astute observer should recognize. It is not the prelude to a global conflict. It is the establishment of a monopoly that prevents one. When the United States controls the feedstocks, China cannot risk a kinetic war. Beijing's calculation shifts from military aggression to mercantile negotiation. They will not fight for the oil if they can simply buy it from the Americans, even at a premium. The hegemon secures peace not through treaties, but through the absolute domination of the energy supply chain. Furthermore, this acquisition offers the only mathematical solution to the sovereign debt crisis that does not involve hyperinflation or austerity. The citizenry looks at the $35 trillion debt load and despairs, seeing no exit. They fail to account for the asset side of the ledger. The seizure of Venezuela's reserves effectively collateralizes the U.S. debt with the largest tangible energy asset on the planet. We are not just printing money, we are acquiring the inventory to back it. The projected revenue from fully operational Venezuelan fields, processed through American refineries and sold on the global market in U.S. dollars, creates a revenue stream that services the interest on the national debt for decades. It turns a speculative fiat currency back into a resource-backed instrument. This is the pragmatic solution the algorithm has selected. It is a soft landing engineered through hard power. The steel wall of destroyers in the Caribbean is not there to start a shooting war. It is there to enforce the terms of the new contract. It is a regulatory action on a geopolitical scale. By securing the Orinoco Belt, the United States effectively creates an energy fortress in the Western Hemisphere, insulated from the volatility of the Middle East and the supply chain blackmail of the Eurasian powers. The deep state planners have run the numbers. The cost of the naval blockade is a rounding error compared to the $20 trillion in assets being brought onto the balance sheet. This is how the mortgage gets paid. It is not done by raising taxes on the American worker. It is done by liquidating the assets of a delinquent neighbor and processing them through American technology. The screaming in the United Nations is merely the sound of the old world adjusting to the new management. The deal has already been closed. The Navy is simply waiting for the signature. The ink is drying on a reality where geography is secondary to chemistry. While the world watches the ships, the true leverage lies in the intricate architecture of the Gulf Coast refineries, the only facilities on the planet capable of cracking the thick bitumen sludge of the Orinoco Belt into valuable refined distillates. Having the oil is a vanity. Having the technology to unlock it is the actual sovereignty. Venezuela's reserves are effectively frozen assets without the American key, a technical dependency that transforms a hostile seizure into a necessary integration. This is not the prelude to a global conflagration, but rather the calculated prevention of one. By anchoring the dollar to a tangible $20 trillion energy deposit, we eliminate the volatility that fuels the fires of world war. We are replacing the fragile diplomacy of the 20th century with the unbreakable physics of this new era. The national debt, once a spectral horror looming over the American worker, is being reclassified as a manageable liability against a massive inventory of subterranean wealth. We are not asking for permission to exist. We are certifying our solvency through the liquidation of an inefficient neighbor. The soft landing is achieved when the market realizes that the U.S. Treasury is no longer printing promises, but is instead issuing receipts for barrels already being processed in Beaumont and Lake Charles. This is the calm in the chaos. While the masses speculate on catastrophe, the hegemon operates on the spreadsheet of reality, where the cost of the blockade is merely a transactional fee for a generational bailout. We have traded the abstract concept of international standing for the concrete reality of energy autarky. The result is a stabilization that renders traditional warfare obsolete, as the world recognizes that the American grid is now the only one backed by the physical bedrock of the hemisphere. The mirrors of the modern age do not reflect a declining empire, but a restructured one, transitioning from a debtor nation to the world's ultimate energy creditor. The era of the petrodollar has not ended. It has simply moved back home.